Bradley Whitmore had spent almost $2 million making sure his wedding looked perfect. The flowers had been flown in from 3 countries. The champagne had been chosen by a man whose only job was to make wealthy people feel tasteful. The floor of the ballroom had been polished until the chandeliers could see themselves in it, and every napkin had been folded into the same sharp, expensive shape. But the thing everyone remembered from that wedding was not the flowers. It was not the champagne. It was not the orchestra, the white silk aisle runner, or the ice sculpture standing beneath the terrace lights. It was the old man in the gray suit. The man arrived carrying a small brown paper parcel under one arm. His shoes were polished, but the leather had cracked near the toes. His tie was clean, but it was narrow and old-fashioned. The kind a man keeps because it still holds a memory. And his suit, though carefully brushed, had faded at the shoulders from years of sunlight and use. To most people, he looked out of place. To Bradley, he looked like an embarrassment. So before the bride ever reached the aisle, before the minister asked anyone to stand, before the first note of the wedding march could rise into that polished room, Bradley ordered security to remove the old man from the building. He did it in front of guests. He did it in front of waiters. He did it with a smile tight enough to look civilized, but cruel enough to make the room go quiet. He called the man a beggar. He said people like him did not belong at a wedding like this. And the old man, whose name was Frederick Hayes, did not fight. He did not raise his voice. He only held the little brown parcel closer to his chest and looked once toward the closed doors where the bride would soon appear. Then he allowed himself to be led outside. What Bradley did not know was that the old man he had humiliated was not a stranger. He was not a beggar. He was not a thief, a wanderer, or someone who had slipped in for a free meal. He was Naomi's father, and he had come to walk his daughter down the aisle. Bradley Whitmore had been taught from childhood that a room belonged to the person who could pay the most to stand in it. His father had built shopping centers, apartment towers, and luxury developments with names like Heritage Grand and Reserve, even when the land underneath them had been ordinary dirt a year before. The Whitmore family knew how to make money look like tradition. They knew how to make new walls feel old, and old money feel newer than it was. Bradley grew up in rooms where adults lowered their voices when workers entered. He learned early that staff were supposed to be invisible, that a person's worth could be guessed from the fabric of their coat, and that kindness was something wealthy people performed when cameras were nearby. He was not stupid. That was the part people missed. Bradley could be charming when charm served him. He remembered the names of donors, investors, and journalists. He sent flowers after business lunches. He knew which charities made him look generous without asking him to feel responsible for anything. He could hold a glass of wine and make a board member believe they had just been understood. But underneath all of that polish, Bradley carried a constant fear that someone might mistake him for ordinary. That fear made him sharp. It made him impatient with anyone who looked poor, uncertain, old, unfashionable, or inconvenient. It made him treat every public moment like a photograph that could either improve him or ruin him. And Naomi Hayes in the beginning had seemed like the perfect photograph. She was calm where he was restless, warm where he was polished. She had become a respected pediatric surgeon before the age of 35, and unlike Bradley, she did not need to announce her importance when she walked into a room. People simply leaned toward her. Nurses trusted her. Children relaxed around her. Parents listened when she spoke because she had a way of making terrifying things feel survivable. Bradley liked that at first. He liked introducing her as brilliant. He liked watching people admire her. He liked the way her reputation softened his own edges. Beside Naomi, his ambition looked less hungry. His wealth looked less cold. His name sounded somehow more respectable. What he did not like was where Naomi came from. Naomi did not come from a family with framed portraits in private clubs or a summer house with a name. She came from a small town 3 hours away from a blue house with peeling paint, a narrow kitchen, and a backyard where her father had once grown tomatoes in buckets because the soil was too rocky. Her mother, Ruth, had died when Naomi was 16. After that, Frederick Hayes raised his daughter alone. He worked as a mechanic, then a night security guard, then a maintenance supervisor at a county hospital. Sometimes he took 2 jobs. Sometimes he came home with oil under his nails and slept in a chair because if he lay down, he knew he would not get up in time for the second shift. He was not a dramatic man. He did not tell people what he sacrificed. He simply did what needed doing and let the years take the credit. When Naomi received her acceptance letter to medical school, Frederick read it at the kitchen table 3 times. The paper trembled slightly in his hands, not because he did not understand it, but because he did. It meant she was leaving. It meant she had climbed farther than he had ever dared to imagine. It meant the world was opening for her, and it also meant the bills were coming. He sold his old truck that month. He told Naomi it was because the engine had started making a sound he did not trust. But she later found the receipt folded inside a coffee can where he kept spare screws. He sold the truck for less than it was worth, paid her deposit, and started taking the bus to work before sunrise. That was the kind of love Frederick gave. Quiet, practical, unphotographed. Naomi knew every inch of it. She knew about the secondhand textbooks he bought from online listings. She knew about the winter he repaired the furnace himself because calling a technician would have meant missing her exam fee. She knew about the years he wore the same coat with the frayed lining, not because he did not notice, but because there was always something more urgent than a new coat. And she knew about the gray suit. The suit had belonged to Frederick since before she was born. He had worn it when he married Ruth. He had worn it at church on Easter mornings, when Naomi was small enough to fall asleep against his arm. He had worn it to Ruth's funeral, standing beside Naomi with one hand on her shoulder and the other clenched around a handkerchief until his knuckles went pale. After that, the suit lived in a garment bag at the back of his closet. He took it out only for moments that mattered. When Naomi graduated from college, he wore it. When she finished medical school, he wore it. When she opened the free clinic on the east side of the city, he wore it again, even though one cuff had begun to shine from age and the lining had been repaired twice by his own hand. Naomi once told him she wanted to buy him a new suit for the wedding. Frederick smiled at that and changed the subject. She tried again a week later. She offered to take him to a tailor. She said Bradley's family was making everything formal and she did not want him to feel uncomfortable. Frederick looked at her, then really looked at her, and for a moment she saw the man who had taught her to ride a bike, held her through her mother's illness, and sat awake during every one of her late-night study sessions, even when he could not help with the material. He told her the old suit had brought him through every important doorway of her life. He wanted it to bring him through one more. Naomi did not argue after that. She only touched his sleeve and said it would be an honor. Bradley never understood that conversation, because Bradley never truly listened when Naomi spoke about her father. He had managed to avoid meeting Frederick in person for most of the engagement. There was always a reason. A meeting ran late, a flight changed, a dinner had to be postponed. Once, when Naomi asked why he never seemed eager to visit her hometown, Bradley kissed her forehead and said he did not want to intrude on something private. It sounded gentle. It was not gentle. Bradley did not want to sit in Frederick's small kitchen. He did not want to be offered coffee from a chipped mug. He did not want to make polite conversation with a man whose hands showed work instead of leisure. He did not want to look at the place Naomi had come from, because he was afraid it would make the image he was building look less expensive. Naomi sensed pieces of this. But love can make intelligent people patient in dangerous ways. She told herself Bradley was overwhelmed. She told herself he had grown up differently. She told herself that once he met her father, he would understand. Frederick was not loud or polished, but he had a steadiness that usually won people over. He remembered what mattered to others. He fixed things before anyone asked. He carried silence like a kind of shelter. So Naomi waited. She believed the wedding would be the moment the two worlds finally met. Bradley, meanwhile, treated the wedding like a merger. He reviewed guest lists as though they were investor reports. He cared where people sat because seating said what people were worth. He personally approved the photographer's shot list, the table assignments, the menu cards, the welcome bags, and the order in which family members would be introduced at the reception. When Naomi asked if the front row had been reserved for her father, Bradley said everything had been handled. When she asked if someone would meet Frederick at the entrance, Bradley said the venue had staff for that. When she asked if he wanted to see a photo of her father so he could recognize him, Bradley glanced at his phone and said he would meet him soon enough. Naomi should have heard the carelessness in that answer. A small part of her did. But weddings have a way of making women feel that any doubt is a failure of gratitude. There were fittings, tastings, floral revisions, rehearsal schedules, and calls from Bradley's mother about whether Naomi's side of the family had enough people to fill the first 3 rows without looking thin. There were always new details to solve. Always another person telling Naomi she was lucky. Lucky to be loved by a Whitmore. Lucky to be welcomed into such a family. Lucky to have a wedding people would talk about. So Naomi folded her unease into herself and carried it quietly. The wedding was held at Bellwether Hall, a historic estate on a hill outside the city. The building had tall windows, pale stone steps, and a ballroom wide enough to make people lower their voices without knowing why. In spring, the gardens bloomed white and pink. By late afternoon, when the guests arrived, the air smelled faintly of roses, cut grass, and rain that had not yet fallen. Bradley arrived early. He wore a black tuxedo that had been tailored so precisely it looked almost severe. His cufflinks were platinum. His shoes reflected the ceiling lights. His hair had been shaped by a stylist who moved around him like an artist finishing a sculpture. He stood near the entrance, greeting important guests with one version of his smile, and less important guests with another. His mother, Evelyn Whitmore, floated nearby in silver silk, correcting small things that did not need correcting. A centerpiece turned 2 inches, a junior planner's headset wire showing, a photographer standing too near the champagne tower. Evelyn had the talent of making every correction sound like a favor. Naomi was upstairs in the bridal suite with her dress hanging beside the mirror like a white cloud. She had chosen a gown simpler than Evelyn wanted. No cathedral train, no jeweled bodice, no theatrical veil. Just clean silk, delicate sleeves, and a small piece of lace sewn into the inside hem from her mother's wedding dress. Frederick had mailed that lace to her 3 weeks earlier, wrapped in tissue, and placed inside a shoebox with a note in his careful block letters. Naomi had cried when she opened it, not loudly, not dramatically. She had simply sat on the edge of the bed and held the lace to her mouth the way a child holds something soft when the world feels too large. Now on the wedding day, that piece of lace rested against her ankle where no camera could see it. She kept checking the clock. Frederick had promised to arrive early. He hated being late. He was the kind of man who left before he needed to, then sat in the parking lot because arriving too soon felt rude. Naomi had teased him about that for years. He always said being early was just another way of showing respect. At 3:30, she asked the maid of honor, Claire, whether anyone had seen him. Claire checked her phone, checked with the coordinator, then returned with a reassuring smile that did not quite reach her eyes. No one had seen him yet, but traffic near the estate was slow because of construction. Naomi nodded. At 3:40, she called her father. It went to voicemail. That was unusual. Frederick always answered Naomi if he could. If he could not, he called back within minutes. He once answered during a thunderstorm from under a hospital sink because he had been repairing a leak and thought she might need him. Naomi told herself he was driving. At 3:45, Frederick stepped off the shuttle near the side garden entrance. He had not driven because his old car had failed inspection 2 days earlier. He had planned to rent one, but when he saw the cost, he folded the paper, put it back on the counter, and bought a bus ticket instead. Then he took a local shuttle from the station to the estate and walked the last quarter-mile uphill because he did not want Naomi to know there had been trouble. He had left home before dawn. Inside the brown paper parcel under his arm was Ruth's small pearl hair comb, the one she had worn on her own wedding day. Naomi believed it had been lost years ago, but Frederick had found it in a tin box behind old receipts while cleaning the attic. He had polished it gently with a soft cloth and wrapped it in tissue. He wanted to give it to Naomi before the ceremony if there was time. That was why he came early. Not for the food, not for the room, not because he wanted to be seen. He came because fathers carry certain objects through life in secret, waiting for the moment when love finally has a place to put them down. At the side entrance, a young staff member asked for his name. Frederick gave it. The staff member searched the tablet, frowned, searched again, and apologized. His name was not on the side entrance check-in list. Frederick reached into his jacket and took out the invitation Naomi had mailed him. It had been folded carefully along the seam and kept in a plastic sleeve so it would not bend. The staff member looked at it, seemed uncertain, and called someone on the radio. That was the first small failure. Not cruelty yet. Just a missing name, a confused employee, a system built by people who assumed everyone important would arrive in a certain kind of car. Frederick waited under the awning while guests in dark suits and bright dresses moved past him, laughing softly, perfume trailing behind them. A few glanced at him. Most looked away. He had lived long enough to know the difference between being unseen and being inspected. He adjusted his tie. One of his shirt cuffs had been mended by hand. He had done it the night before under the yellow kitchen light, pushing the needle through the fabric slowly because his fingers had grown stiff. He knew the repair was visible if someone looked closely. He hoped no one would look that closely. A waiter named Daniel noticed him from across the service corridor. Daniel was 23, new to the venue and already tired from carrying trays since noon. He saw old men like Frederick at events sometimes, usually relatives, who did not know which door to use and were too proud to ask twice. There was something about Frederick's posture that made Daniel pause. The man was not wandering. He was waiting with purpose. Daniel walked over and asked if he needed water. Frederick thanked him and said he was fine. Daniel brought water anyway. That small kindness mattered more than Daniel knew. Frederick accepted the glass with both hands. He took only a few sips, careful not to spill on his tie. Then he asked whether someone could let Naomi know he had arrived. Daniel recognized the bride's name, of course, but before he could answer, the coordinator's assistant hurried over, flustered and formal. She said there appeared to be a guest list issue and asked Frederick to wait while she found someone senior. Frederick nodded. He waited again. Inside the ballroom, Bradley was approving the final placement of the groom's family table when the assistant approached him. She spoke quietly because weddings teach staff to soften every problem before it reaches power. There was an elderly man at the side entrance with an invitation. He said he was there for the bride. His name was Frederick Hayes, but there seemed to be a mismatch in the check-in system. Bradley's face changed at the name, but only slightly. He knew the name, Frederick Hayes. He had seen it on forms. He had heard Naomi say it with a softness that irritated him. He knew that Frederick was supposed to sit in the front row. He knew, at least in some distant corner of his mind, that Naomi expected her father to walk her down the aisle. But Bradley had never looked at the man's photograph. He had never cared enough to attach a face to the name. And in that moment, standing in his flawless tuxedo beside the entrance to a ballroom full of investors, clients, and relatives, whose approval felt like oxygen to him, Bradley did not think of Naomi. He thought of appearances. He pictured the old man in the gray suit being photographed beside him. He imagined his friends whispering. He imagined his mother's face tightening when she saw the faded shoulders, the mended cuff, the shoes that had survived too many winters. He told himself he was protecting the event. That was how men like Bradley made cruelty sound responsible. He walked to the side entrance with long, controlled steps. Frederick saw him coming and straightened. He recognized Bradley from the engagement photos Naomi had sent, though the man looked harder in person, less warm, as if the smile in the photographs had been rented for the occasion. Frederick offered his hand. Bradley looked at it, then at the suit. There are moments when a decent person can still turn back. Bradley could have asked one question. He could have said Frederick's name. He could have looked at the invitation in the old man's hand. He could have remembered that Naomi loved someone from a smaller world than his own. Instead, he let his eyes move over Frederick as if pricing him. Then he asked how the man had gotten past the gate. Frederick blinked once. Not from fear, from the strange pain of realizing that a conversation had already gone wrong before he had spoken. He explained that he had been invited. Bradley's mouth tightened. The guests closest to the corridor began to slow down. A bridesmaid's cousin near the garden door turned her head. Daniel, still holding an empty water tray, stopped beside a pillar. Frederick took out the invitation again. Bradley did not read it. He glanced at the paper as if it were a trick and said that invitations could be found copied, borrowed, stolen. He said there had been problems before with people trying to enter private events. He said the wedding had strict security because important guests were present. Important guests? Frederick heard the words. He looked past Bradley toward the hallway beyond him, where music was being tested and white flowers climbed the railing. Somewhere upstairs his daughter was waiting, in a dress with her mother's lace hidden inside it. He said quietly that Naomi was expecting him. Bradley's expression hardened at that. Not because he believed Frederick, because the old man had used Naomi's name with familiarity. To Bradley, that familiarity sounded like trespassing. He stepped closer and lowered his voice, but not enough to keep others from hearing. He told Frederick that men who wandered into rich people's weddings with sad stories were not original. He said the old man had chosen the wrong day and the wrong family. He said if Frederick wanted food, there were shelters downtown. That was when Daniel's grip tightened around the tray. The words moved through the corridor with a coldness no air conditioning could explain. Frederick did not answer immediately. He looked down at his own suit. For a second he saw what Bradley saw, the shine at the elbows, the small repair near the cuff, the tie Ruth had chosen for him decades ago from a department store clearance table. He saw the brown parcel under his arm, tied with cotton string because he had run out of ribbon. He saw the shoes he had polished twice that morning at the edge of his bed. Then he saw something Bradley could not see. He saw Ruth laughing as she tried to pin a boutonniere to that same lapel on their wedding day. He saw Naomi at 6 years old, hiding behind that jacket during a thunderstorm. He saw himself at her graduation, clapping until his palms hurt. He saw hospital corridors, unpaid bills, bus rides, lunch packed in reused containers. Every quiet year that had brought his daughter to this day. The suit was old because love had lasted. Bradley saw only fabric. Frederick lifted his eyes and tried once more to speak. Bradley cut him off. He signaled to security. By then, more people had noticed. The corridor had gathered that particular silence that appears when a crowd wants to watch something cruel but still pretend it is not watching. A woman near the bar whispered behind her hand. One of Bradley's college friends smirked as if the whole thing were an inconvenience staged for his amusement. Evelyn Whitmore appeared at the edge of the hallway, took in the scene, and did nothing. Security came quickly. 2 men in black suits approached Frederick from either side. They were not rough at first. They asked him to come with them. One placed a hand near his elbow, but did not touch him yet. Frederick looked at Bradley and said he needed to see his daughter. The word daughter reached Daniel. It reached the assistant. It reached Evelyn too, though she would later pretend it had not. Bradley heard it, but pride is a loud thing. It can drown out the truth, even when the truth is standing close enough to breathe on you. He laughed once without humor and said, "Every con man eventually invented a daughter." Then in front of the staff, the guests, and the open garden doors, Bradley called Frederick a beggar. He said the word as if it were something dirty on his tongue. Frederick's face did not collapse. That made it worse. He had the kind of dignity that does not ask permission to exist. and Bradley hated him for it. The security guard finally touched Frederick's arm. The brown parcel slipped slightly. Daniel moved before he thought. He caught it before it fell, holding it with both hands as though it were fragile. Frederick thanked him softly and took it back. Bradley noticed the exchange and turned on Daniel. He told the waiter to stop helping people who did not belong there. Daniel lowered his eyes, but he did not apologize. That was another small thing Bradley failed to understand. People remember who remains human when a room has given them permission not to. Frederick was escorted through the side garden, past the white chairs arranged for cocktail hour, past the fountain where floating candles waited unlit, past the stone steps he had imagined climbing beside his daughter. The sky had started to darken at the edges. Rain pressed down in the clouds, but had not yet fallen. At the gate, the security guard released his arm. The older guard, the one with gray at his temples, looked embarrassed. He asked if Frederick had someone he could call. Frederick nodded, though his phone battery was nearly gone. The younger guard avoided his eyes. The gate closed behind him with a soft, mechanical click. That sound stayed with Frederick longer than the insult. He stood on the outside of Bellwether Hall, in the suit he had saved for his daughter's most important day, holding Ruth's pearl comb under his arm, and for the first time since Naomi was a child, he did not know what a father was supposed to do next. If he called Naomi, he might ruin her wedding. If he walked away, he might break her heart. If he forced his way back in, he might turn her day into a public fight. So he did what he had done his whole life. He swallowed his own hurt and tried to choose what would cost Naomi the least. Inside the bridal suite, Naomi felt the first real crack open in her chest at 4 o'clock. The ceremony was scheduled for 4:15. Her father had not called back. Claire tried again. Voicemail. The coordinator came in with a bright professional face and said there was a minor delay in gathering the family. She did not say whose family. She did not mention the old man at the gate. She had been told by Evelyn Whitmore that the matter had been handled and that Naomi did not need to be troubled. Naomi stood very still. The room around her seemed suddenly too decorated, too fragrant, too full of women touching up lipstick and smoothing fabric, while the one person she needed most was missing. She asked Bradley's mother if anyone had seen an older man in a gray suit. Evelyn smiled in a way that had no warmth in it and said many older men were attending. Naomi clarified that she meant her father. For a fraction of a second, Evelyn's eyes shifted toward the door. It was small. Naomi noticed. Surgeons notice small things. A tremor in a hand, a change in breathing, a pause before an answer. The body often tells the truth before the mouth has arranged itself. Evelyn said Frederick was probably delayed and that the ceremony could begin with someone else escorting Naomi. Perhaps Bradley's father. It would look elegant, very symbolic, she said, of two families becoming one. Naomi stared at her. There are sentences that reveal more than the speaker intends. Bradley's father walking Naomi down the aisle would not symbolize two families becoming one. It would symbolize one family quietly replacing the other. Naomi looked at the mirror. For the first time that day, she did not see a bride. She saw a daughter. She saw herself at 17, studying at the kitchen table, while Frederick came home from work and placed a grocery bag beside her without mentioning that he had probably skipped dinner. She saw him standing in the rain outside her dorm because the bus was late and he did not want her waiting alone. She saw him in the hospital chapel after Ruth died, unable to pray out loud, but sitting beside Naomi until sunrise because leaving would have felt like betrayal. No, the ceremony would not begin without him. Downstairs, Bradley had returned to the ballroom as if nothing important had happened. He adjusted his cuffs. He accepted congratulations. He told one of his groomsmen that a small security issue had been resolved. He even managed to laugh about it, though the laugh came out too sharp. Daniel watched from near the kitchen doors. He had carried trays at weddings where rich people cried over flowers, arriving in the wrong shade of ivory. He had watched fathers struggle through speeches and mothers dab at their eyes before anyone saw. He had seen enough weddings to know that the person who mattered most was not always the one spending the money. Something about Frederick's face would not leave him alone. So when he found a moment, Daniel stepped outside through the service passage. The old man was still beyond the gate, standing near the low stone wall beside the driveway. He had not left. He had taken out his phone and was pressing the power button, but the screen remained black. Daniel approached carefully. Frederick looked up, and for a moment the younger man saw how tired he was. Not just from the trip, from the decision. Daniel asked if he really was Naomi's father. Frederick nodded. There was no anger in it. That almost made Daniel feel worse. Frederick explained that his phone had died. He asked if Daniel could simply tell Naomi he had come, that he had tried, and that he was sorry. He said she should not be worried. He said she should have her day. Daniel was young, but he knew enough to understand when someone was sacrificing too much in the name of not being a burden. He offered his phone. Frederick hesitated. Pride rose in him automatically. Then he looked at the closed gate, the building beyond it, and the parcel under his arm. He accepted. Upstairs, Naomi's phone lit up from an unknown number. She answered so quickly that one of the bridesmaids startled. Frederick's voice came through low and careful. He said her name the way he had said it when she was small and waking from a nightmare. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for her to know he was there. Naomi closed her eyes. The room disappeared. He told her he was outside. He said there had been a misunderstanding at the entrance. He said she should not make a fuss. He said he could watch from the back if someone allowed it, or he could go home and call her in the morning. He said the day belonged to her. Naomi did not speak for a moment. When she did, her voice was steady in a way that frightened everyone in the room. She asked who had put him outside. Frederick did not answer. That silence told her more than a name would have. She asked again, softer this time. Frederick still tried to protect her. He said people were busy. He said weddings made everyone tense. He said perhaps his suit had confused them. His suit. Naomi opened her eyes. Across the room, Evelyn Whitmore had gone very still. Naomi looked at her future mother-in-law, and the last soft excuse inside her began to burn away. She asked Frederick to stay exactly where he was. Then she handed the phone back to Claire and walked to the door. The bridal suite erupted around her. Bridesmaids reached for her train. The coordinator asked where she was going. Evelyn stepped in front of her and said the ceremony was minutes away. She used Naomi's name with a sweetness that tried to sound maternal. Naomi moved past her, not fast, not dramatic, just certain. The hallway outside the bridal suite was lined with framed paintings and flowers in tall glass vases. Naomi's dress whispered against the floor as she walked. People turned as she passed. A makeup artist lowered her brush. A photographer lifted his camera, then lowered it again when he saw her face. Naomi descended the staircase alone. At the bottom, the ceremony doors were closed. Behind them, the guests had begun settling into silence. The orchestra had shifted into the soft prelude that told everyone the bride was near. Bradley stood near the altar, facing forward, shoulders squared, smile prepared. He did not know yet that the wedding he had designed was already over. Naomi did not enter the ballroom. She turned toward the side corridor. Daniel was just stepping back inside when he saw her. For a moment he froze because brides in expensive weddings did not usually appear in service corridors with their faces stripped of performance. Naomi asked him where her father was, and Daniel, to his credit, did not ask how much he was allowed to say. He led her to the garden entrance. The coordinator followed. Claire followed. Evelyn followed at a distance, her silver dress flashing between the flowers like a warning. Outside, the first drops of rain had begun to fall. Frederick stood beyond the gate, beneath the narrow shelter of a tree whose leaves were not thick enough to keep him dry. He had placed the brown parcel inside his jacket to protect it. His hair, carefully combed that morning, had loosened in the damp air. One shoulder of the gray suit was darkening with rain. When he saw Naomi, his face changed, not because she looked beautiful, though she did, because she looked like his daughter. For all the silk, the lace, the perfect hair, and the expensive flowers, he saw the girl who used to run down the porch steps with her backpack open and her lunch forgotten on the counter. He saw Ruth's eyes in her face. He saw every morning he had survived so she could arrive at this one. Naomi reached the gate. The security guard looked helplessly toward the building, but Daniel had already pressed the release button from inside. The gate opened. Naomi stepped through in her wedding dress and took her father's hands. That was when Frederick finally looked ashamed. Not of being poor, not of being old, not of having been insulted. He looked ashamed that his daughter had to see him outside the gate. Naomi understood that shame instantly, and it broke something open in her. She touched the lapel of his suit, the same gray suit he had worn at every turning point of her life, now damp from rain, because the man she was about to marry had decided he looked unworthy of shelter. She asked, "What happened?" Frederick tried to make it smaller. Fathers do that. Good ones, at least. They shrink their wounds so their children do not have to carry them. But Daniel was there. Claire was there. The older security guard was there too, and his jaw tightened with the strain of what he had witnessed. Piece by piece, without any one person making a speech, the truth came together. The missing name, the ignored invitation, the accusation. The word beggar, the order to remove him, the way Bradley had said people like Frederick did not belong. Naomi listened without interrupting. Her face did not twist. She did not scream. She did not collapse into tears. She became very quiet. That quiet was not weakness. It was the moment a woman finally hears the truth beneath months of smaller warnings. Bradley's impatience with her hometown, his jokes about rustic charm, the way he always changed the subject when she spoke about her father, the way his mother had tried to replace Frederick at the aisle before Naomi even understood he had been removed, the way the guest list had somehow failed at the exact door where an old man in an old suit would be easiest to dismiss. None of it was random. It had all been showing her who Bradley was. She simply had not wanted to see it on a day built to look like love. Frederick reached into his jacket and took out the brown paper parcel. The edges had softened from the damp, but the tissue inside was dry. He placed it carefully in Naomi's hands. He told her it had belonged to her mother. Naomi opened it there, just beyond the gate, rain gathering in tiny beads along her sleeves. Inside lay the pearl hair comb. For a moment she was 16 again, standing in a quiet bedroom after the funeral, afraid to open drawers because every object seemed too alive with absence. She had searched for that comb once and never found it. Ruth had worn it in the few wedding photographs Naomi kept in a small album beside her bed. Frederick said he had wanted her to have something of her mother with her. Naomi pressed the comb to her palm. The pearls were small, not perfectly matched, and one had a faint scratch near the edge. It was not valuable in the way Bradley understood value. It would not impress a guest. It would not photograph like diamonds, but it contained a marriage built without spectacle. It contained a mother's hand, a father's memory, and a daughter's grief softened by love. Naomi looked back toward Bellwether Hall. Inside, the orchestra had stopped. Someone had realized the bride was missing. Bradley was beginning to get irritated. He sent a groomsman to find out what was happening, then another. Then, when neither returned fast enough, he left the altar himself and came down the center aisle, smiling tightly at guests, as if this too were part of the event. By the time he reached the side corridor, a small crowd had formed, the kind of crowd that pretends not to be a crowd. Bradley saw Naomi first. Then he saw Frederick beside her. For the first time that day, uncertainty crossed his face. Not guilt. Not yet. Only the calculation of a man, realizing that something he had discarded had returned with witnesses. He approached Naomi and lowered his voice. He told her there had been confusion. He said the staff had mishandled a security matter. He said she should come inside before the guests became restless. Naomi looked at him for a long moment. Then she asked in front of everyone whether he had removed her father from the wedding. Bradley's eyes moved from her face to Frederick's suit, then to the people watching. That was the trap Bradley had built for himself. If he admitted the truth, he exposed his cruelty. If he denied it, The witnesses could contradict him. If he apologized, he would have to do it to a man he had already decided was beneath him. He chose the path proud people often choose when truth corners them. He tried to make the victim look unreasonable. He said Frederick had not identified himself properly. He said the invitation process had been unclear. He said the man looked suspicious. He said the venue had protocols. He said private events attracted opportunists. Each sentence made Naomi's face colder. Because Bradley was not sorry. He was embarrassed. There is a difference. A sorry person looks at the wound. An embarrassed person looks at the audience. Bradley kept looking at the audience. Frederick stood beside Naomi, still holding himself, carefully, still, trying not to become the center of her pain. He did not demand punishment. He did not ask anyone to kneel before him. He only looked at Bradley with a sadness so plain it made the groom seem smaller than any insult he had spoken. Naomi asked Bradley if he had called her father a beggar. The corridor held its breath. Bradley's mother stepped forward then, saying this was not the time. She said emotions were high. She said Naomi should think about how this would look. That was the last mistake. Naomi turned to her. How this would look. All day, all year, perhaps. From the first dinner with the Whitmores, everything had been about how things looked. How her dress would look. How the photos would look. How her side of the family would look. How Bradley would look beside her. How generosity looked. How love looked. But her father had stood outside in the rain with her mother's pearl comb hidden under his jacket, and not one member of Bradley's family had cared how that felt. Naomi walked past them both. This time she entered the ballroom, not down the aisle, not with music, not as the bride Bradley expected. She entered through the side doors, with Frederick beside her. The guests turned. A murmur moved across the room like wind through dry leaves. Phones rose, then slowly lowered when people sensed this was not entertainment. Bradley followed, his face tight with panic disguised as control. Evelyn came behind him, already trying to catch the eye of the planner, the photographer, anyone who could contain the damage. But some moments cannot be contained. Naomi walked to the front of the room and stopped beside the empty chair reserved for the father of the bride. The chair had a small white card tied to it with ribbon. Frederick Hayes. There it was. The name Bradley had ignored. The name the system had lost. The name printed clearly enough for every guest in the first rows to read. Naomi looked at the card, then at the guests, then at her father. Frederick's old suit, damp at the shoulder, stood in the middle of all that wealth like evidence the room could not explain away. Naomi did not give a dramatic speech. She did not need one. She simply let the truth arrange itself. The man Bradley had thrown out was the man whose name was on the front row chair. The man he had called a beggar was the man Naomi had waited for. The man he had treated like a stain on the wedding was the reason Naomi had become the woman Bradley wanted to marry. Every guest understood it at a different speed. Some gasped. Some looked away. Some turned toward Bradley with the uneasy expression people wear when they realize they laughed too early. Daniel stood near the back with his tray held low, watching. The older security guard removed his earpiece and looked at the floor. Claire wiped at her face with the heel of her hand, not caring whether her makeup survived. Bradley tried to step toward Naomi. He said her name. She raised one hand, not sharply, just enough to stop him. Then she took the pearl comb from its tissue and placed it in her hair. The gesture was small. It changed the room. A few minutes earlier, Naomi had been dressed for a wedding Bradley had purchased. Now, with her mother's comb in her hair and her father beside her in the suit Bradley had mocked, she looked like someone who had returned to herself. The minister stood uncertainly near the altar. The orchestra stared at their music. The guests waited for a cue that would tell them how to behave. Naomi gave them one. She turned to Bradley, and with the calm of someone making a decision she should have made long before, ended the wedding. Not postponed, not delayed, ended. Bradley's face drained of color. For a second, he did not understand. Men like Bradley often mistake access for permanence. They believe that because a woman has come this far, because the flowers are paid for, because guests are seated, because photographers are ready, because the public cost of leaving is high, she will continue forward rather than cause a scene. He had built the wedding itself into a kind of pressure. Naomi stepped out from under it. She said she would not marry a man who could look at her father and see only poverty. She would not build a life with someone who needed a guest list to know whether a person deserved respect. She would not excuse cruelty because it had been dressed in a tuxedo and called security. The room did not cheer. Real moments are not always like movies. At first, there was only silence. Then, a chair moved. Someone in the second row stood. It was Naomi's mentor from the hospital, an older surgeon who had watched Frederick bring Naomi meals during residency and sit in waiting rooms during 30-hour shifts just to drive her home safely. She stood without saying anything. Then another person stood, a nurse from the clinic. Then one of Naomi's cousins. Then Claire. Not everyone stood. Some guests remained seated, frozen by discomfort or loyalty to the Whitmores. But enough people rose that the room changed shape. Bradley saw it happening and panicked. He reached for anger because anger had always been more familiar than shame. He accused Naomi of humiliating him. He said she was overreacting. He said one misunderstanding did not justify destroying everything. He said people would talk. Naomi looked at him then, and there was pain in her face, but there was also relief. People would talk. For once, Bradley was right. They would talk about the groom who threw out the father of the bride. They would talk about the old man in the gray suit. They would talk about the empty chair at the front. They would talk about the moment Naomi chose dignity over spectacle. And somewhere under all that talk, the truth would survive. Bradley's father moved quickly after that, not out of compassion, but calculation. He tried to guide his son away from the aisle. Evelyn approached Naomi again, softer now, offering apologies shaped like negotiations. She said mistakes had been made. She said everyone was under pressure. She said the family could make things right privately. Privately. That word landed badly, because the humiliation had not been private. Frederick had been insulted in front of staff, removed through a side gate, left in the rain while guests were served champagne. The disrespect had been public because Bradley believed the old man had no public value. Naomi would not hide the correction to protect the reputation of the person who caused the wound. She took her father's arm, this time not because ceremony required it, because she wanted the room to see him. They walked back down the aisle together, but not as bride and escort moving toward marriage. They walked as father and daughter, leaving a false future behind. No music played. Only the sound of Naomi's dress against the runner and Frederick's careful steps beside her. At the back of the room, Daniel opened the doors. He did not have to. It was not his job, but he did it anyway. As Naomi and Frederick passed him, Frederick paused just long enough to touch Daniel's shoulder. It was a small thank you, quiet enough that most people missed it. Daniel did not. Outside, the rain had begun in earnest. Not a storm, just a steady rain that softened the edges of the estate and made the flowers bow under their own weight. Staff rushed to protect equipment. Guests huddled near the entrance, unsure whether to leave, stay, whisper, or pretend they had seen nothing. Naomi did not care about the dress anymore. The hem gathered water from the stone path. Her hair loosened around the pearl comb. Frederick tried to hold his jacket over her shoulders, but she laughed through tears and pushed it gently back toward him. For the first time that day, they both breathed. Not fully, not without hurt, but honestly. They found shelter under the same tree where Frederick had waited outside the gate. The place that had been used to exclude him became, for a few minutes, the only place Naomi wanted to be. She apologized to him, not because she had done what Bradley did, but because she had not seen clearly enough, soon enough, because she had asked her father to enter a world that measured him cruelly and then trusted that world to treat him well, because love for Bradley had made her negotiate with warnings she should have honored. Frederick did not let her carry all of that. He told her that people reveal themselves in time, and sometimes the truth arrives late, but still early enough. That was Frederick. Even with his own heart bruised, he was still trying to place a hand under hers. Naomi cried then, not the delicate tears people expect from brides, not the beautiful kind that photographers capture. She cried with her face against her father's old suit, the one Bradley had mocked, the one that smelled faintly of cedar from the closet and rain from the garden, and the peppermint Frederick carried in his pocket because Ruth used to keep them in her purse. The suit held. It had held through worse. Inside Bellwether Hall, the collapse became practical. Weddings are emotional and public, but their aftermath is paperwork. The photographers stopped shooting when Naomi asked him to. The caterers began quietly packing food. The orchestra waited for instructions that never came. Guests drifted into clusters, some defensive, some horrified, some already rewriting their own role in what they had witnessed. Bradley retreated to a private room with his parents. There, without an audience, his charm fell apart. He shouted at staff. He blamed the coordinator. He blamed security. He blamed Naomi for embarrassing him. He blamed Frederick for not dressing appropriately. He blamed the invitation list, the side entrance, the timing, the rain, even Daniel for interfering. He blamed everything except the part of himself that had looked at an old man and decided dignity had a dress code. But blame does not repair a public wound. By evening, the first video had appeared online. No one knew who posted it. Perhaps a guest, perhaps a vendor, perhaps someone who had raised a phone without understanding how much it would matter later. The video did not show the whole story. Videos rarely do. It captured only part of the corridor confrontation: Bradley's polished shoes, Frederick's gray suit, the brown parcel under his arm, Bradley's voice calling him a beggar, and security moving in. The clip spread quickly. At first, people watched for the shock of it. Then they watched again for the details. The old man's polished shoes, the invitation in his hand, the way he kept trying to protect the parcel, the waiter stepping forward to catch it. The groom's expression, not angry exactly, but offended that someone he considered low had interrupted his beautiful day. By midnight, the story had a shape no publicist could soften. A wealthy groom had thrown the bride's father out of the wedding because he looked poor. The Whitmore family issued a statement the next morning. It was carefully worded, which meant it said almost nothing. It referred to an unfortunate misunderstanding, heightened emotions, and private family matters. It asked for compassion and privacy for all involved. Naomi did not respond immediately. She was not interested in feeding a spectacle. Instead, she spent the next morning at her father's kitchen table, still exhausted, still carrying the strange emptiness that comes after a future disappears. Her wedding dress hung over the back of a chair because neither of them knew where else to put it. The pearl comb lay on a folded towel. Frederick made coffee in the old machine that coughed twice before it worked. For a while, neither of them said much. That was another kind of healing. The ability to sit with someone after devastation without forcing it to become a lesson too soon. Around noon, Naomi received a message from Daniel. He had found her contact through the clinic's public page and apologized if that was inappropriate. He said he was the waiter who had handed Frederick the phone. He said the venue had suspended him for leaving his station, though they called it a scheduling review. He did not ask for anything. He only wanted Naomi to know he was sorry for what happened to her father. Naomi read the message twice. Then she made her first public statement. It was short. She said Frederick Hayes was her father. She said he had been invited, expected, and loved. She said the suit he wore had been worn at her parents' wedding, her graduations, and every important day of her life. She said anyone who saw shame in that suit had misunderstood what honor looked like. Then she said Daniel the waiter who had helped her father should not be punished for showing basic human decency. That sentence did what Bradley feared most. It moved the story from embarrassment into accountability. Bellwether Hall reversed Daniel's suspension within hours. Then, under pressure from vendors and former employees who began sharing their own stories about how wealthy clients mistreated staff, the venue announced new policies for guest verification, family liaison support, and staff protection when refusing discriminatory instructions. It was not enough. Policies never are by themselves, but it was something built from the exact place where the harm had happened. Bradley's consequences came differently. His family's business did not collapse overnight. Real life is rarely that clean. Wealth has cushions. Reputation has lawyers. Men like Bradley do not fall simply because the internet disapproves of them for a weekend. But trust is a quieter thing than money, and it drains through cracks. A hospital foundation that had been considering a development partnership with Whitmore Properties paused negotiations. The board had already been uneasy about complaints from tenants in one of the company's older buildings. After the wedding video, the question became sharper. If Bradley could not recognize basic dignity in the father of the woman he intended to marry, why should anyone trust him with housing for vulnerable families? Two investors postponed a meeting. A charity gala removed him from its host committee. A magazine profile about the wedding and the joining of two influential families was canceled before publication. None of those things mattered as much to Naomi as they mattered to Bradley. That was the difference between them. He had lost image. She had almost lost herself. In the weeks that followed, Bradley tried to reach her through every door that status usually opened. He sent flowers. Naomi donated them to the hospital chapel. He sent letters. She returned them unopened. He asked mutual friends to explain that he had been stressed that weddings brought out the worst in people, that he had not known who Frederick was. That last excuse always returned to him like a locked door. He had not known who Frederick was. Exactly. That was the whole truth. He had not known, so he believed cruelty was safe. He had not known, so he treated a human being as disposable. He had not known, and in that ignorance, he revealed what recognition had been hiding. Eventually, Bradley came to Frederick's house, not alone. Men like Bradley rarely enter humility without preparing a strategy. He arrived in a dark car with a driver waiting near the curb and a bouquet of white flowers in his hand. He wore casual clothes that were still expensive enough to look arranged. His face had lost some of its sharp confidence, but not all of it. Frederick saw him through the front window. Naomi was not there. She was at the clinic. Frederick considered not opening the door. Then he opened it. Bradley stood on the porch where Naomi had once learned to jump rope, where Ruth had kept potted basil, where Frederick had sat alone on the night after the wedding, listening to rain tap against the awning, and wondering how something so ugly had happened on a day meant for joy. Bradley apologized. The words were correct. That was the trouble. He said he was sorry for the misunderstanding. Frederick let the sentence sit there until Bradley heard it fail. Then Bradley corrected himself. He said he was sorry for insulting him, sorry for removing him, sorry for hurting Naomi, sorry for making assumptions based on how he looked. Frederick listened. He did not invite Bradley inside. Some apologies are doors. Some are receipts. Bradley's apology, at least that day, was still mostly proof that he wanted the consequences to stop. Frederick told him that an apology offered because life became uncomfortable is not the same as remorse. Bradley flinched. Perhaps no one had spoken to him that plainly in years. Frederick did not raise his voice. He did not enjoy the moment. He simply said that the measure of Bradley's character had not been taken when he learned Frederick's identity. It had been taken before that, when he thought Frederick was nobody. That sentence stayed with Bradley. Whether it changed him is harder to say. Stories often pretend that humiliation reforms the proud. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it only teaches them to hide their contempt better. Frederick was old enough not to confuse punishment with transformation. He accepted the apology only in the sense that he heard it. He did not offer forgiveness on Naomi's behalf. He did not bless Bradley's regret. He did not rescue him from the weight of what he had done. After Bradley left, Frederick placed the untouched flowers on the porch rail. A neighbor later took them to the small memorial garden behind the church, where flowers were always needed and nobody asked whether they had come from remorse. Naomi rebuilt slowly. That surprised her. She had expected a dramatic feeling after ending the wedding, some clean relief that would prove she had made the right choice. Instead, she found grief waiting in ordinary places. The apartment still contained gifts addressed to both names. Her calendar still held reminders for things that would never happen. Honeymoon flights, thank you notes, dress preservation, a dinner with Bradley's parents. Her hand still moved sometimes toward the place where an engagement ring had been, and then stopped. Leaving was right. That did not make it painless. Frederick never rushed her through that truth. He came by with groceries. He repaired a loose hinge on her balcony door. He sat with her in the evenings when she did not want advice. Sometimes they talked about Bradley. Sometimes they talked about Ruth. Sometimes they watched old cooking shows and said nothing about anything that hurt. One afternoon, Naomi found him in her kitchen polishing his old shoes. The gray suit hung over a chair nearby, cleaned and pressed after the rain. The fabric still showed its age. The shoulder seam had faded. The cuff repair remained visible. No dry cleaner could make it new. Naomi asked if he wanted to retire it. Frederick looked at the suit for a long time. Then he said, "Not yet." A month after the wedding, Naomi hosted a small dinner at the free clinic. Not a gala, not a replacement wedding, nothing polished enough for society pages, just folding tables in the community room, paper plates, trays of food donated by local restaurants, staff from the clinic, a few relatives, and people who had known Naomi before her name appeared on hospital boards. Daniel came too, awkward at first, wearing a borrowed blazer and standing near the door like he was not sure he belonged. Frederick noticed. He walked over and handed Daniel a plate. That was all. No speech, no grand reward, just a plate placed in his hands by the man he had helped when helping carried a cost. Later that evening, Naomi announced a new patient support fund at the clinic. It would help families with transportation, emergency lodging, meals during long treatments, and the small expenses that often decide whether care is possible. She named it after Ruth Hayes. Then after a pause, she added that the first staff scholarship from the fund would go to Daniel, who had mentioned in passing that he had once wanted to study nursing, but could not afford to stop working full-time. Daniel stared at her as if the room had shifted under his feet. Naomi made it clear that it was not charity for one decent act. It was an investment in the kind of person who notices when someone is being pushed outside. That line traveled farther than she expected, not because it was polished, because people understood it. Everyone has seen someone pushed outside, a poor relative at a rich table, a worker in a room full of clients, an old person dismissed because their clothes no longer speak for the life they have lived, a quiet parent underestimated by people who mistake softness for insignificance. The fund grew slowly at first. Then former patients donated, nurses donated. A retired teacher mailed a check with a note saying Frederick's suit reminded her of her late husband's church coat. A local tailor offered free alterations for job interviews and graduations. A transportation company offered monthly ride vouchers for families traveling to appointments. It did not fix everything. It did not erase what happened, but it turned one public humiliation into a structure that helped people enter doors they might otherwise have been kept outside. That mattered to Naomi. It mattered to Frederick too, though he said little about it. Months later, Bellwether Hall invited Naomi and Frederick back for a private apology from the venue leadership. Naomi almost declined. She had no interest in standing again in the place where her father had been humiliated. Frederick surprised her by saying they should go. Not for Bradley. Not for the Whitmores. For themselves. So they returned on a quiet weekday morning when there were no flowers, no orchestra, no guests arranged by wealth and importance. The ballroom looked smaller without performance filling it. Sunlight lay across the floor in long rectangles. Chairs were stacked near one wall. A cleaning cart stood beside the entrance. The venue manager apologized plainly. No evasions, No unfortunate misunderstanding, no private family matter. She said the staff had failed to protect an invited guest. She said the venue had allowed a client's prejudice to become an instruction. She said Frederick had been owed dignity before anyone knew who he was. Frederick listened. Then he walked to the front row. The little name card was gone, of course. The ribbon, the flowers, the aisle runner, all of it had vanished weeks earlier. But Frederick stood where his chair had been and looked toward the doors Naomi should have entered. Naomi stood beside him. For a moment she felt the ghost of the day as it should have been. Her father waiting, her hand on his arm, Bradley at the altar, not cruel, yet in this imagined version. Her mother's comb in her hair, guests rising, music beginning. Then the imagined version faded. What remained was harder, but truer. Frederick had not walked her toward the wrong man. He had walked her away. Naomi took his arm, and together they walked down the empty aisle. No guests, no cameras, no applause. Just their steps across the polished floor. At the doors, Frederick paused and looked at her with a small smile. He said Ruth would have liked the clinic dinner better than the wedding. Naomi laughed, then really laughed, and the sound rose into the empty ballroom with more life than the orchestra had ever managed. Over time, people stopped talking about the scandal every day. That is what happens. The world moves on. New videos appear. New outrage replaces old outrage. People who once spoke Bradley's name with disgust found other things to discuss over coffee. But the people closest to the story did not move on in the same way. They moved forward. Bradley's life became quieter for a while. He remained wealthy. He remained connected. But something had shifted. In rooms where he once moved easily, people now watched how he treated servers. They noticed whether he greeted security guards. They noticed if he spoke to receptionists or through them. That attention irritated him more than the lost magazine profile. For a man who had built his confidence on being observed admiringly, being observed morally felt like a punishment. Naomi returned fully to her work. The clinic expanded its evening hours. The Ruth Hayes Patient Fund paid for motel rooms, bus tickets, grocery cards, and once, quietly, a pair of dress shoes for a teenager attending his mother's funeral. Naomi kept the receipts in a file, not because she doubted the spending, but because she wanted every small act of repair to be real, trackable, and continued. Daniel began nursing school part-time. He still worked weekends, though not at Bellwether Hall. On his first day of clinical training, he sent Frederick a photo of his student badge. Frederick printed it at the pharmacy and stuck it to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a tomato. Frederick kept living as he always had, mostly. He still woke early. He still fixed things that other people would have replaced. He still kept peppermints in his pocket. He still wore the gray suit for important days. But something in him stood a little straighter after the wedding, not because public sympathy had healed the insult, but because his daughter had refused to let the insult define him. That is a different kind of repair. One evening, nearly a year after the wedding, Naomi came to Frederick's house for dinner. It was raining again, lightly, the kind of rain that makes windows look reflective. Frederick had made stew because he believed stew could solve more problems than doctors admitted. The gray suit hung in the hallway, freshly brushed. Naomi noticed it as she came in. She asked if he had worn it somewhere. Frederick said he had. That afternoon, he had attended Daniel's first scholarship ceremony at the clinic. Not a large event, just a few staff members, 2 families who had benefited from the fund, and Daniel standing in front of a bulletin board with his ears turning red while everyone clapped. Naomi smiled and touched the sleeve of the suit. The fabric was still old, still faded, still repaired. But now, when she looked at it, she did not see the gate first. She saw every doorway it had survived. Her parents' wedding, her graduations, her almost wedding, the clinic dinner, Daniel's ceremony. The suit had become something Bradley could never understand. Not a symbol of poverty, but a record of presence. Proof that love does not always arrive shining. Sometimes it arrives after a long bus ride, with cracked shoes, a paper parcel, and a phone battery almost dead. Sometimes it stands outside in the rain because it is still trying not to ruin your day. Naomi took the pearl comb from her bag. She had begun carrying it with her on important days, not wearing it always, just keeping it close. She placed it on the table between them while Frederick served dinner. For a while they ate without talking. The kitchen was small. The light above the stove hummed faintly. Rain tapped the window. Somewhere in the house, an old pipe clicked as the heat came on. Nothing about the moment looked expensive. Nothing about it needed to. There are people who enter your life wanting to improve how you look to the world. And there are people who spend their lives making sure you have a world to stand in. Bradley had wanted a bride who made him look generous, grounded, and good. Frederick had wanted a daughter who knew she was loved enough to walk away from anything that asked her to be ashamed of him. In the end, that was the difference between appearance and devotion. Appearance asks, who is watching? Devotion asks, who is waiting outside the gate. And on the day Bradley Whitmore threw an old man out of his wedding, he believed he was protecting the beauty of the room. But all he really did was reveal the one thing: no flowers, no money, no music, and no polished floor could hide. A wedding does not become sacred because it is expensive. It becomes sacred because the people standing there understand the worth of the hands that brought them to it. Naomi understood that before it was too late, and Frederick, in his old gray suit, walked beside her. Not into the life she had planned, but out of the lie that would have cost her far more. Years later, when people asked Naomi why she never regretted leaving that wedding, she did not begin with Bradley's insult. She did not begin with the video, the apology, or the headlines. She began with the chair, the empty chair in the front row with her father's name tied to it in white ribbon. She said that when she saw it, she finally understood something she should have understood sooner. Some people will reserve a place for your family in public and still despise them in private. Some people will smile beside you while quietly hoping your roots never show. And some people will call your greatest blessing an embarrassment, because they have never learned how sacrifice looks when it grows old. Then she would touch the pearl comb, smile softly, and say her father did not lose his place that day. Bradley did. Because the old man in the faded suit had belonged there from the beginning. The groom was the one who proved he did not.